Okay, so influenza RNA segment packaging. This is something that we've started to understand a little bit better, but we don't have complete understanding of. So we'll go kind of fast through this. Anyway, there's the 5' and 3' non-coding regions at the back and front of the viral RNA, so that negative strand RNA. And those are going to give segment-specific packaging to particular segments. So these are the bits that are going to ensure that you get exactly one copy of each segment into each influenza virion, which is a very neat thing. So they link together in some way and form a unit so that everything is always in the same place in the unit. There's one in the center, and then there are 7 that go around the outside. And yeah, they all seem to form up in a specific way. Kind of neat. So those specific packaging signals are located toward the terminus. They are in the non-coding regions of each of the strands. It has its own version of that. And you can see the result here on the next slide. There we go. So this is these are some electron microscope photographs of influenza virus. And yeah, let's take a look. Okay, so let's start out in that top left panel. You see the long thing that's kind of like a long stretched out letter O? That is the membrane. So on the outside of the membrane, you can see one line. That's actually the outer leaflet of the membrane, so the outer layer. Notice how the inner leaflet is really thick and black and kind of blurred out almost. That is both the inner leaflet of the bilayer and the M protein together. Because the M protein is pushed right up into that inner leaflet and it doesn't do a thing to the outer leaflet. And then sticking out of the outside, so in this I should say all the black stuff is going to be proteins or lipids or just, something like matter, and all the white stuff is just going to be sort of emptiness. That's how you can interpret these. And on the outside of the virion, you can see all the little hemagglutinin proteins, and it looks like this one's mostly hemagglutinin. Some of them get neuraminidase, some of them don't have as much neuraminidase. It seems to be optional. You can make a virus without neuraminidase, it's just that it doesn't get out of the cell very well without neuraminidase. Or rather, it doesn't leave the cell very well. So, in the top, you can see there are 3 long things. They kind of look like a caterpillar hanging down or something from the top of that virion. This is the long sausage-shaped one. Those are 3 of the segments. So this is a slice through the middle of the virion, and you're seeing that slice has 3 of the little segments in it. And so that's how they stick in the side view. And then if you want to see it in the top view, like if we were to slice it crossways at 90 degrees to the top image, then it would look like the one at the bottom. So bottom left, and there you can see it. You've got one segment in the center, and you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 around the outside. So that's a 7 plus 1 arrangement. And that is exactly what you see in every single influenza virus particle. And look at the big image. So this is zoomed out a little bit so you can see more of them. But yeah, count them. You got 7 in every single one, except for a couple where you only have 3 or 4 or 5 or 2. And those are the ones where you're just sampling down at the bottom. Like look at the long version of the virion, the long slice over at the left. And you'll see that some of those segments go right down and some of those segments are kind of short. They stop up near the top. So if you were to cut a cross section down near the bottom, you might go through 1 segment or 2 segments or not even a single segment. But if you cut a slice up near the top of the virion, then you're going to get all of the segments just like that. And so that's exactly how it happens. And so this is showing how those segments come together. So you've got the M protein that is the glue, and that's the part they're not really showing here. But the M protein is going to attach to the bottoms of the hemagglutinins, and it's going to hold them together. And then they're going to be clustered around this little bundle of all of the segments, all 8 segments rather, 1 in the middle, 7 on the outside. They're all sort of chained together like it shows over at the right. And yeah, this is from a paper by Takeshi Noda. I guess you'd say Takashi Noda. But yeah, he's real good at his job and does a great job on electron microscopy during assembly of influenza viruses. Okay, and so what we think, and what a paper that I no, I'm still working on. It's not yet published yet. After show is that at the front of the virus, that's where you line up all of the hemagglutinins. So they sit all there. And then at the back of the virus, sort of the last thing to come out of the cell, that's where we're going to pack in all those neuraminases. And we're able to do that because there's a different form of the M protein that you find back there. It's a little different than the one you find on the sides and on the tip of the virus. All right, next slide. So, viruses definitely steal host lipids, so they're stealing the plasma membrane of the cell as they leave. Now, they've pushed most of the proteins out to make room for lots and lots of hemagglutinins, and they're really closely packed. But there'll still be a couple of host proteins that come packed with, right there on the surface of the influenza virion. So this is just showing some of these influenza virions. A couple of them already left the cell, and one of them looks like it is just about to leave the cell. Now, influenza also does not use the escort pathway, and like coronavirus, it's going to use its ion channel. So the M2 seems to be the important factor that's going to do the job of the escort. It's going to cut off the virus from the cell, and so that way the virus can bud and leave. Okay, so as it says here, budding is coordinated. Budding is the process of making a brand new virus. And so all of the proteins are going to be targeted to the surface of the cell, the outside surface. So the HA and the NA and the M2 are going to get there. And then the M1 is going to arrive. It's going to bind to the ribonucleic proteins that are coming out of the nucleus. And it's going to escort them out and escorts them right up there to the surface. And then the M is going to hook onto the bottoms of all those other proteins and hook them together, and boom, they're going to build a nice little virion. And then once it's there, this is going to happen preferentially, so more often than not, at these things that are called lipid rafts. So lipid rafts are areas of your membrane, of your cells, that contain sphingolipids, which are a little bit taller than regular lipids. And so they sort of sit out, and they don't like to mix with the other lipids. They like to stay with the other sphingolipids. So they are, it's like a little floating island that floats around the surface of your cells. And the proteins of influenza virus, like the HA and the NA and the M2, all have extra long transmembrane regions. And so they just lock into those regions with the sphingolipids. And so that's how the proteins get clustered together. The sphingolipids just cluster the proteins, and then boom, the virus can go right up there, and the M1 can bind them. And then, just like it says, the M1, which is the matrix, will bind to the ribonucleic proteins and bind to the membrane and cause curvature of the host membrane, just like a little rainbow. Okay, and then virus particles are actively released, and this is done by the M2 protein. So the M2 protein will cut the viruses off from the surface, and that's something else that wasn't known when this slide set was put together, but we know it now. But then the virus has a problem because, remember, this cell is covered with proteins, and the proteins are covered with sialic acid. And so a new virus tries to go out, and then, bloop, it's going to bind to another protein. And so it's going to get stuck to the cell it just came out of. It's like tetherin without the tetherin, which is nice for us. So here's where the neuraminidase comes in. Neuraminidase is a little bit slow. That's the Na enzyme. And neuraminidase is going to cleave off sialic acid. So hemagglutinin binds sialic acid, neuraminidase cleaves off sialic acid, and it's going to release the virus. And then the virus can go free. And that's how the virus prevents itself from getting stuck at the cell surface. The other way that helps the virus is that you have a lot of sugars on your mucus. So mucin is covered in these sugar chains, and I believe they also have sialic acids. And so we make these things specifically to go out and bind up all of the influenza virus proteins we can find. And yeah, they do a pretty good job, which is great. Okay, so here's that same process shown in graphic form. When the virus has assembled, it's going to come out, and those little hemagglutinins are going to run into those sialic acids on the surface of all those proteins on the outside of the cell, and they're going to bind to it. And from the virus's perspective, this is wasteful, stupid, and a really bad idea because the virus has already conquered this cell, made copies of itself, tried to come out, and then got stuck, going back to the same old thing. That's not what you want, right? And so, yeah, we're going to need something to come along to release us from the cell, and that's going to be on the next slide. The neuraminidase is the part that comes along, and it just cuts off all the little receptors on the cell so that the virus can go free. And so the neuroaminidases tend to come out at the end, and yeah, the hemagglutinins go and bind to something, and then the neuroaminidase will reach around and cut it off. And so that is how the virus is able to spread. And we know this is important because drugs like Tamiflu, which is also Tamifir, and Relenza, which is Zanamivir, both of these things will inhibit the flu virus by preventing it from spreading. So they don't stop the virus from entering, they don't stop the virus from replicating, they don't stop the virus from assembling and coming out of the cell. But once the virus is out, they block the neuraminidase so that the virus gets stuck all over the surface of the cell and can't leave. And that's the idea. And that is enough. That gives us a little bit of an advantage against the flu virus and helps some people get better by about a day faster than normal. So, over here, this is like an overview of everything that we've seen so far. So, we've got attachment. And remember the protein? That's going to be the hemagglutinins. And you remember what it's going to attach to? That's going to be sialic acid. And we'll go into the kinds of sialic acid in the next section. But we're going to bind the sialic acid, great, and then that's a signal to get pulled into the cell, so endocytosis, and so most likely a clathrin-coated pit. There are other ways to do endocytosis, so I don't want to imply that clathrin is the only way to get in, but in this case, it's going to be a useful little shorthand. So when you think of endocytosis, that's fine if you think of a clathrin-coated pit. Anyway, after endocytosis, then we're going to have those proton pumps on the outside. We're going to acidify the vesicle, and we're going to pump those little H pluses in. That's how it happens. And then when the pH gets low to about 5 or 5.5, then we protonate those histidines, and then from that point, the histidines come out. We ruined that slide. Okay, so what kinds of hemagglutinins do we have? What kinds of neuraminidase do we have? So you see all these types, H1, H2, H3, H4, whatever. These are all types of hemagglutinins. Now the way we decide what a hemagglutinins type is that you find an antibody, so something left over from the immune system, from an immune reaction, and you use that antibody, and if you got an antibody that binds to one thing and it's different from all the other ones, doesn't bind to the others, then that's fine. That's a useful antibody. So there will be an H1 antibody, and if the H1 reference antibody binds to a hemagglutinins, then it is going to be called an H1 hemagglutinins. But if the H1 antibody and H2 antibody don't bind and the H3 antibody does bind and the rest of them don't bind, then we'll say, oh, it's an H3 hemagglutinins, just like that. So hemagglutinins go up to at least 18. There may actually be a 19th now. I got to see if that one was actually published yet. But yeah, there are a lot of kinds out there, to be sure. Almost all of them, as you can see here, occur in wild animals and particularly in wild birds. So H1 through H15, these are things that you find in wild birds. Things like ducks and geese have H1 through H12, just tons of it. And every different kind. And you can see there are a couple kinds like H7 and H3 that we can get in horses, and seals can get H4 and H7, and pigs and people can get H1 and H3. People used to get H2, but the H2 viruses have actually gone extinct again. So there are birds that have H2, but there are no humans that have H2 right now, which is kind of interesting. So if we're looking for one that could reemerge, yeah, an H2 virus that picks up the H2 from a bird influenza virus could definitely do that. Down at the bottom, you've got a couple of new types. The H17 and 18 only occur in bats. Yeah. And I think that thing in H16 is a weird picture of a duck. I think we ran out of nice pictures of a duck to put in there. Neuraminidase is the same sort of deal. So N1 through N9 are found in all kinds of birds, but definitely in things like ducks and geese. So yeah, watch out for those farmed poultry slash migrating wild duck-like birds. Yeah, real problem. And you've also got the neuraminidase types there. Yeah, N1 through N11, and the last two are so far only found in bats, but they're all neuraminidases. And yeah, some of these things are going to have slightly different specificity than others. So, for example, there are some hemagglutinins on here that work really well for birds and don't work very well for humans because birds and humans have different kinds of sialic acid. So, we're going to get to that in, I believe, the next lecture. All right, so we're back. Next section. All right. So, yeah, here's this little story of what's been going on with flu over the ages. So, influenza Bs aren't discovered until the late 1970s, and so we don't really know what's going on with those before that. But presumably, there were influenza Bs. They have a long evolutionary history from the ones that we have around at the moment. But yeah, the other neat thing is that H1N1 Spanish flu, it kills a lot of people in 1918 and 1919, but then after that, it goes on and it is just the regular flu. And so the question is, did the virus mellow out and change, or did it kill off all the people that it could, like all the susceptible people? And then everybody who's left is basically either the winner of it or a child of a winner. Yeah. And we don't have a good way to answer that question because that virus actually kind of disappears. It is no longer the dominant form. In the 1950s to 1960s, so from yeah, Korean War to the Vietnam War, fantastic. We had the H2N2 Asian flu was the world's number one dominant flu. There was still a little bit of H1N1 around, but not as much. Then H3N2, the Hong Kong flu, starts out in the late 1960s, and that's one that's going right through to the same day, or rather to today. The H1N1 Russian flu is actually a modified version of the H1N1 Spanish flu, and that one comes back. So that was basically the flu that everybody got in, I don't know, 2000 through about 2010 was still the old Spanish flu, the old H1N1, and it just didn't kill people the way it used to. Now, the neat thing that happened in 2009 was the novel H1N1, and when that thing came along, as you can see right there, it actually drives the regular H1N1 out of existence. So these two things were competing for the same receptors and the same people, and yeah, there can be only one, as with Highlanders. And so, yeah, the new H1N1, the quote unquote swine flu, actually murdered the old 1918 flu's, great grandchild, basically. And so that one is extinct outside of laboratories, yeah, in the world now, which is kind of cool. So, yeah, we live in an H1N1, H3N2 world, and we have these two B strains, B Victoria and B Yamagata, yeah, from Japan, but now everywhere.